My name is John Miller. I'm 58 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that family was the one thing you could always count on. Life has a funny way of teaching you lessons, though. Some lessons are gentle, some are painful, and a few leave scars that ache even when the weather changes. My story is one of those last kinds. I was born and raised in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where the local diner knows your order before you sit down, and where people wave to each other from across the street whether they know you or not. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. My wife Margaret and I met in high school. She had this quiet smile that made everything feel possible, and from the moment I sat behind her in English class, I knew she was the one. We married young, too young maybe, but it felt right. We didn't have much, but we had each other. Margaret was the kind of woman who could turn a small rented apartment into a warm home just by hanging curtains or putting a fresh pie on the windowsill. She was sunshine in human form. When our daughter Emily was born, it felt like the world cracked open and poured light into our lives. I can still remember holding her tiny body for the first time, her little fists clenching at the air, her cheeks soft and warm against mine. In that moment, I silently promised her that I would do everything in my power to give her a life full of love, safety, and opportunity. I wasn't born into wealth, and I didn't magically stumble into it either. I worked long hours in a manufacturing plant, often coming home with grease under my nails and my back aching. There were nights when I skipped dinner so Emily could have seconds. Mornings when I left before dawn to pick up overtime kissing Margaret's forehead and tiptoeing past the crib. It wasn't easy, but I never resented it. I told myself this is what fathers do. Our little house was nothing special. A 2-bedroom with squeaky floors and a leaky faucet that never quite sealed. But in that house, Emily took her first steps across the faded carpet. She learned to ride her bike down our cracked driveway. She made me hand-drawn birthday cards with crooked letters that spelled out, "I love you, Dad." When Margaret fell ill years later, I felt my world wobble. She had always been the stronger one between us, and suddenly I was the one holding her hand through hospital visits, through treatments that left her weak and frail. Emily was a teenager then, too busy with friends, school dances, and dreams of leaving town. I didn't blame her. She was young, and I wanted her to live without the shadow of sickness. But sometimes, when I sat by Margaret's bedside, I wished our daughter had been there more. When Margaret passed, my heart cracked in a way I didn't think could ever mend. It was like someone had taken away half my soul and left me with only an echo of myself. Emily and I clung to each other at the funeral. I thought at least I still have her. She's my reason to keep going. After the funeral, it was just the two of us in that same small house. I tried to fill the silence with conversation, with cooking lessons, with stories from when she was a baby. Emily would smile politely, but I could see her slipping further away into her own world. She had dreams bigger than this town, and I didn't want to be the one to hold her back. Years went by, and I watched her grow into a smart, beautiful young woman. She went off to college in New York City, and though it nearly broke me to say goodbye, I knew it was the right thing. I saved every dollar I could to help her pay tuition, even sold the old Chevy I loved so much. Whenever I got her calls, I felt a mix of pride and longing. She was my girl chasing her dreams, and I was the father who kept the lights on back home cheering for her from afar. Then one chilly November morning, everything changed. I woke up to the phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was Emily. I hadn't heard her voice in weeks, and my heart jumped just seeing her name on the screen. She sounded breathless, almost giddy. "Dad," she said, "you're not going to believe this. Uncle Robert passed away, and he left me everything. $33 million. I sat up straight, stunned. $33 million. It was more money than I could even picture. Robert had been Margaret's uncle, a quiet man who lived in a big old house on the East Coast. He never married, never had kids, and while he and I weren't particularly close, he adored Emily. He used to say she had her mother's spark. I remember smiling through tears. "Honey, that's amazing," I whispered. My mind was racing, not with envy, but with relief. All those years of worrying about her future, about whether she'd have enough, whether she'd struggle like I did, gone in a moment. I thought maybe this was Margaret's last gift to her from beyond the grave. But even in that first conversation, something was off. Emily's voice had a tone I wasn't used to. It wasn't the warmth I had clung to after her mother passed. It was sharp, impatient, almost businesslike. She told me she was busy with lawyers, with investors, with new opportunities. She said she'd be flying out to California soon. She sounded like a stranger trying on a new identity, one that didn't leave room for the man who had raised her. I told myself not to worry. Money changes people, sure, but maybe she was just overwhelmed. Maybe once she settled into her new life, she'd remember who had been by her side all along. But deep inside, in a place I didn't want to look too closely, I felt something shift. A shadow faint, but present, like the first dark cloud on a clear horizon. I didn't know it yet, but that phone call was the start of everything. The betrayal, the silence, the revenge. All of it was already written, I just hadn't seen the script. The days after that phone call felt strangely quiet. I went about my routines like nothing had changed, making coffee in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper, walking to the corner store. But in the back of my mind, I kept repeating that number, $33 million. It was almost comical to me. I'd spent my entire life budgeting down to the last cent, making sure bills got paid on time, stretching a dollar until it squealed. And now my daughter was suddenly wealthier than most people in our state would ever dream of being. I couldn't help but smile when I thought about her freedom. No more student loans, no more late-night shifts at the cafe where she used to work during college, no more wondering if she could afford an apartment in the city. She was free. That's what I told myself. She was free, and maybe for the first time since Margaret died, I felt relief. Emily didn't come back home after the news. She stayed in New York, saying there were too many meetings, too many signatures, too many things to arrange. I didn't blame her. I imagined lawyers in expensive suits, accountants with briefcases full of contracts, men and women eager to get their slice of the pie. I told myself she needed to focus. But in truth, I missed her voice. When she did call, her tone had changed. It wasn't just excitement anymore, it was a sort of superiority I'd never heard before. She talked about numbers, millions invested here, thousands spent there, with the kind of casualness I'd use to describe buying groceries. She laughed about flying first class for the first time. She joked about how her friends called her the heiress. I listened, smiling into the receiver, even though my stomach felt unsettled. Every time I tried to ask how she was feeling or whether she was taking care of herself, she brushed me off. "Dad, I'm fine. You wouldn't understand, things are different now." That sentence stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. You wouldn't understand. I told myself it was stress talking. Money doesn't just change your bank account. It changes the way people look at you, the way they treat you, the way they suddenly want something from you. I figured she was adjusting, and that once the dust settled, she'd call me back with the same warmth she had as a child. But the dust never settled. It swirled. About a month later, she flew out to Los Angeles. She called me from her new condo overlooking the Pacific Ocean. She described the view glass windows from floor to ceiling, white marble countertops, a balcony that seemed to hang over the water itself. I tried to picture her there, standing barefoot on the balcony with the sun on her face. Part of me was proud. Another part felt left behind. She started posting photos online, her with new friends, women in designer dresses, men with watches that cost more than my house. There were bottles of champagne, exotic cars, weekend trips to places I'd only ever seen on postcards. I scrolled through them at night alone in my quiet house, trying to reconcile the girl in those photos with the daughter I once taught to bake cookies. Neighbors began to ask about her. At the diner, people would lean over and say, "John, we saw Emily's pictures. She's really living the dream, huh?" I'd smile politely, nod, and take another sip of coffee, pretending their words didn't sting. They didn't know the ache of realizing your daughter was slipping into a world where you no longer fit. I sent her a letter once. I figured she was too busy to really talk, so maybe she'd read it in a quiet moment. I told her I was proud of her, reminded her of Margaret's kindness, and asked her to always keep that kindness close, no matter how big her bank account got. Weeks passed, and I never heard back. Instead, when she finally called, it was to tell me about a man she'd met. His name was Daniel. "Dad, he's incredible," she gushed. "He's charming, smart, and he knows so much about business. He's already helping me make big decisions." I wanted to believe her. I really did, but something in her voice felt rehearsed, like she was reading lines someone else had written. I didn't say much, just that I hoped he treated her well. The truth is, I couldn't shake the worry. I'd worked long enough in factories around every kind of hustler and talker to know that charm often hides sharp teeth. And the timing, a man suddenly appearing when she came into millions, was too convenient. But I swallowed my doubts. she wouldn't have listened anyway. Meanwhile, her spending grew bolder. She bought a sports car, then another. She sent me photos of a necklace that looked like it could pay off every mortgage on our street. She laughed about how she tipped waiters with $100 bills just because she could. I tried to smile through it, but inside I was terrified. Not for the money, I never wanted a dime of it, but for the way it seemed to be consuming her. It was like watching her drift further and further out to sea while I stood helpless on the shore. One night, after scrolling through her latest photos, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the old family album. I flipped through pages of Emily in pigtails, Emily holding a fishing rod bigger than her, Emily blowing out candles with her mother by her side. I whispered to the empty room, "Please don't forget where you came from." But deep down, I knew she already had. It wasn't just the money. It was the look in her eyes when we did speak. A kind of distance, a calculation, as if she were measuring whether I still had a place in her new world. That hurt more than any bank account could heal. The night I realized it fully, I couldn't sleep. I walked out onto the porch, the November wind cold against my face, and stared at the stars. They looked the same as they always had. Eternal, steady, indifferent. And I thought maybe that's what I have to be now. Steady patient. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life has a way of correcting itself. I didn't know how or when, but I knew trouble was coming. And I knew I had to be ready. Money changes many things. Houses, cars, wardrobes the size of your smile in photographs. But the thing that cut me deepest wasn't what Emily bought. It was what I began to see in her eyes. I'll never forget the first time I noticed it. She had flown back to New York after weeks in California, and she invited me to dinner in the city. I took a bus and a train to get there wearing my best jacket, the same one I wore to Margaret's funeral because I wanted to look presentable. A father should look proud sitting across from his daughter in a fancy restaurant, not like some small-town man out of place. When I walked in, she was already seated, dressed in a gown that sparkled under the dim lights, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup immaculate. She looked stunning, but also different. There was a hardness in her expression, something I didn't recognize. "Dad?" she said, standing to kiss my cheek. But even in that greeting, there was a distance, like she was performing affection rather than feeling it. We sat and I tried to talk about simple things, the weather back home, the neighbor's new dog, how I'd been fixing up the garden. She nodded politely, but her eyes wandered, scanning the room, almost as if she hoped someone more interesting might interrupt. When the waiter came, she ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly groceries. I didn't say anything, but when the bill came later, I felt my hands tremble at the sight of the number. She signed it casually, like it was nothing. But what stayed with me wasn't the wine or the dinner or the bill. It was the moment halfway through the meal when I said, "You know your mother would be so proud of you." Emily paused her fork midair and looked at me. For a split second, I saw something flicker in her eyes, not pride, not gratitude, but irritation. As if I had reminded her of a past she was trying to bury under designer clothes and glittering lights. She gave a polite smile, quickly changed the subject, and I felt my chest tighten. That night, walking back to the cheap motel where I was staying, I kept seeing that look, a look that measured me, not as her father, but as a man who no longer belonged in the world she was building. Over the next few months, the distance only grew. She started calling less often. When she did, her words were clipped, rushed, distracted. "Dad, I'm in a meeting. Dad, I can't talk long. Dad, I'll call you later." Later rarely came. I began to hear more about Daniel, the fiancé. She spoke of him as if he were some genius, sent from heaven, the man with all the answers, the one steering her money into investments I couldn't even pronounce. I asked once if she was sure about him, if she really trusted him. Her reply was sharp. "Dad, don't be old-fashioned. You don't get it." That phrase again, "you don't get it." I stayed silent, but inside I felt something twisting. I knew her well enough to recognize when someone else's voice was echoing through hers. Daniel's. I began to notice little humiliations, too. Once she sent a car service to pick me up for a gathering at her condo. I thought it was kind of her until I overheard her laughing with friends later that night, saying, "My dad wouldn't know how to get around here without help." They all chuckled, glasses clinking, while I sat quietly in the corner, pretending not to hear. Another time, she introduced me at a party as John. My father, he's from Ohio. Just that. No warmth, no pride in my sacrifices, no acknowledgement of who I'd been in her life. Just a label, a man from Ohio who didn't belong among her new crowd. I smiled through it all, but inside something cracked. At night, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling fan in my quiet house. Memories would play in my head: the time I carried Emily on my shoulders at the county fair, the time she cried after scraping her knee, and I kissed it better, the time she hugged me so tight on her first day of school because she didn't want me to leave. Where had that little girl gone? Who was this woman who now looked at me with impatience, as if I were a weight holding her down? I kept telling myself she was just overwhelmed, that she'd circle back, that she'd realize money doesn't replace blood. But each time I saw her, the space between us widened. One evening, I was invited again to her place. It was a penthouse in Los Angeles this time. Sleek white walls, abstract art glass furniture that looked too fragile to touch. She floated around the room in a silk robe, laughing with friends' champagne in hand. I stood near the window, looking out at the glittering city below. She walked past me, barely acknowledging I was there, her eyes scanning her guests instead. I turned to look at her, and for just a second, she met my gaze. It was in that second I saw it clearly, that shift in her eyes. Coldness, calculation, as if she was trying to decide whether I was still useful to her. That realization sat heavy in my chest. It wasn't the wealth that scared me. It wasn't even Daniel, though I didn't trust him. What scared me most was the possibility that my daughter no longer saw me as her father, that I had been demoted from protector-provider and guide to an inconvenience in her shiny new world. I left early that night telling her I was tired. She barely noticed. On the plane ride home, I stared out at the dark clouds and thought something's coming, something bad, and I'll be the one left standing in the wreckage if I don't prepare. There are moments in life you never forget. The kind that burn themselves into your memory so deeply that no matter how many years pass, you can close your eyes and feel them all over again. For me, that moment was the day my daughter told me to leave. It was a Saturday afternoon in spring. The air was warm, the kind of day that used to mean mowing the lawn, grilling burgers, hearing children laugh in the distance. But that day carried none of that comfort. Emily had invited me to her new mansion in Los Angeles, a house so massive it could have fit my entire neighborhood inside it. White pillars, imported marble floors, a swimming pool that shimmered like liquid glass. It was the sort of place you'd see in glossy magazines, not somewhere I ever thought I'd walk barefoot. When I stepped inside, my heart twisted. Hanging in the grand hallway was a portrait of her and Daniel. Not a simple snapshot, but a commissioned oil painting, the kind that made them look like royalty. His arm around her, her smile wide, their wealth practically dripping from the canvas. There wasn't a single picture of me or Margaret anywhere. Not in the hallway, not in the living room, not even in her private study. It was as if her life had started with Daniel, and everything before him had been erased. We sat down in her living room, if you could even call it that. It was more like a showroom, spotless cold, full of furniture no one ever really sat on. Emily perched on the edge of a white leather sofa, Daniel beside her with that smug smile I'd grown to hate. "Dad," she began, her tone clipped and rehearsed. "We need to talk." I knew immediately something was wrong. She wasn't looking at me the way a daughter looks at her father. Her eyes were sharp, businesslike. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. She took a deep breath, then said it. "You can't stay here anymore. This lifestyle, it doesn't match yours. Daniel and I need space to live our lives, and honestly, you wouldn't be comfortable here." For a second, I thought I hadn't heard her correctly. My ears rang, my chest tightened. "What do you mean?" I asked softly, though my voice cracked. She sighed as if I were a burden, a problem to be solved. "Dad, you're set in your ways. You belong in Ohio, not here. I can't have you hanging around reminding me of the past. It's time for me to move forward." Daniel put his hand on her knee and added, "It's for the best, John. She's building a new life. You should be happy for her." Happy for her. The words hit like a slap. I looked at my daughter, my little girl, who once clutched my hand at the grocery store, who once whispered, "Don't let go, Daddy," at the carnival, and all I saw was a stranger with cold eyes. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand she remember every sacrifice, every meal skipped, so she could eat every sleepless night I spent working overtime to keep her safe. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, slowly, stood up, and said, "All right." Emily barely looked at me as I walked to the door. No hug, no kiss on the cheek, not even a thank you for the years I gave her. Daniel's smirk followed me out like a shadow. I drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a few old photographs I'd grabbed from my house before coming out. That night, I lay on the stiff mattress staring at the ceiling, the hum of the broken air conditioner filling the silence. I thought about Margaret. What would she say if she saw this? The daughter she loved more than life itself, turning her back on me, on us. I imagined Margaret's gentle voice saying, "Don't let this break you, John." But it did. It broke me in ways I couldn't put into words. The next morning, I walked to a nearby diner and ordered the cheapest breakfast on the menu, 2 eggs toast, black coffee. I sat in the corner, my hands trembling as I held the mug, replaying every moment of the day before. The humiliation, the coldness in Emily's voice, the smug look on Daniel's face. It wasn't just about being thrown out. It was about being discarded, as if the years I spent raising her had no weight, no meaning, as if I were just some old man taking up space in her new life. I went back to the motel, sat on the edge of the bed, and pulled out one of the old photographs. It was of Emily when she was 6, sitting on Margaret's lap with ice cream smeared across her cheeks. Margaret was laughing, her arms wrapped around our little girl, sunlight streaming through the window. They both looked so alive, so full of love. I held that picture until my hands ached, whispering, "What happened to you, Emily? Where did you go?" For days, I walked aimlessly through the streets, watching other families' parents with children holding hands, fathers lifting their kids onto their shoulders. Each sight was like a knife. I envied them, but more than that, I mourned what I had lost. I thought betrayal would come with anger, with shouting matches and slammed doors. But mine came quietly with polished words and polite dismissals. It came with a smile that wasn't real and eyes that looked through me instead of at me. That night, back in the motel, I sat in the dark and made myself a promise. I would not beg to be let back into her world. I would not plead for scraps of affection. If Emily wanted to cut me out, then so be it. But I would not be broken forever. I whispered into the silence, "You may have thrown me out, Emily, but one day you'll see the truth. And when that day comes, I'll be ready." The motel room became my cave, small, dim, with peeling wallpaper and a hum from the neon sign outside that never seemed to stop. At first, I thought I'd only stay a night or two until Emily cooled down, until she called and said she regretted everything, but the phone never rang. Days stretched into a week, and then another, until I realized she had truly shut the door on me. I stopped waiting. Instead, I started watching. I'm not a man of wealth or power, but I've lived long enough to know that silence is often the strongest weapon. Anger makes you careless. Rage makes you sloppy. But silence lets you see everything. I moved in with an old friend from the plant, Carl, who lived in a small house out in the suburbs of Los Angeles. Carl was the kind of man who never asked too many questions. He saw the lines on my face, the heaviness in my voice, and just nodded. "Stay as long as you need," he said. That was enough. From his spare bedroom, I began to follow Emily's new life from the shadows. Social media made it easy. Photos of parties by the pool, champagne towers, endless shopping trips, designer outfits that changed daily. And always, always Daniel at her side, his arm wrapped around her like he owned her. I couldn't shake the feeling he was the key to everything. The way he looked at me when he told me to be happy for her. The way he smiled, smug and too polished, like a man who had played this game before. So I began digging. At first, I didn't know where to start, but I remembered what my father used to say: every man leaves footprints, no matter how carefully he walks. I started with public records. Daniel wasn't hard to find. He had lived in 3 different states over the past decade, each time leaving behind failed businesses, unpaid debts, and ex-partners who wanted nothing to do with him. The deeper I went, the uglier it got. Lawsuits dismissed for lack of evidence, complaints of fraud that never made it to court, partnerships dissolved overnight, and then the whispers online, old news clippings, blog posts from people who claimed they'd been scammed by him. Always the same story charm: promises, investments, then disappearance. I printed everything I found and kept it in a leather notebook I carried everywhere. Names, dates, amounts of money. Patterns started to emerge. Daniel wasn't just lucky. He was a predator. He hunted for people like Emily, young, wealthy, a little naive, eager to trust someone who spoke the language of wealth with confidence. Every night, I sat at Carl's kitchen table after he went to bed, poring over the notebook. The evidence wasn't enough for the police, not yet. Men like Daniel knew how to cover their tracks, but I wasn't interested in rushing. I'd learned patience in the factory, waiting for machines to break down, waiting for supervisors to notice my work, waiting for paychecks that never stretched far enough. Patience was my skill, and now it would be my weapon. I didn't confront Emily. I didn't call her, didn't send letters, didn't show up at her mansion. She wouldn't have listened anyway. If I tried to warn her, she'd only hear Daniel's voice telling her I was jealous, bitter old-fashioned. No, she needed to discover the truth herself. My job was to be ready when the curtain fell. But that didn't make it easier. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Margaret. She would have known what to do. She would have seen through Daniel in an instant. She always had a gift for reading people, for sensing their true intentions beneath the surface. I felt her absence like a wound that never healed. Sometimes I'd whisper into the dark, "Help me, Margaret. Help me protect her even from herself." And in those moments, I almost believed she was still guiding me. Meanwhile, Emily's world grew louder and more reckless. News articles began to appear about her wild spending, her presence at celebrity parties, her new empire of businesses Daniel was supposedly managing. I read each one carefully, underlining Daniel's name every time it appeared. My notebook thickened with clippings and notes until it felt heavy enough to crush me. Carl noticed my late nights, my tired eyes. One morning over coffee, he said, "You're planning something, aren't you?" I looked at him silent. He didn't press, just patted my shoulder and said, "Good. Don't let them think they've beaten you." That became my mantra. Don't let them think they've beaten you. So I kept watching, listening, writing. I followed Daniel's movements online, tracing his network of shell companies, his fake investment schemes, his sudden appearances at luxury resorts. Each breadcrumb added to the trail. I also started going out, not to parties, but to places where people like Daniel left traces. Courthouses, real estate offices, even quiet conversations with bartenders who had seen him throwing money around recklessly. People talk, especially when they sense you're not a threat. I collected their words like gold. And through it all, I stayed silent. To Emily, I was gone out of sight, out of mind. To Daniel, I was irrelevant, an old man tucked away somewhere in Ohio. But that was my advantage. They didn't see me coming. Every betrayal plants a seed. Some men rush to tear it out. I chose to water it, to let it grow until it was strong enough to strangle the one who sowed it. The day would come when Emily would see the truth. And when she did, I would be there not to gloat, not to scream, but to remind her of who had always been in her corner. Until then, I stayed in the shadows, watching, waiting, planning. If betrayal felt like a knife to the chest, watching the cracks form in Emily's new world felt more like waiting for an avalanche. You see the snow piling higher and higher, you hear the distant rumble, and deep down, you know it's only a matter of time before the whole mountain collapses. From Carl's spare room, I watched my daughter's life unravel in slow motion. At first, it looked like everything she touched turned to gold. Magazine spreads about her new lifestyle, photos of her on red carpets, videos of her and Daniel arriving at events in sleek black cars. The world called her glamorous. I just saw her drifting further from the little girl who once begged me to push her higher on the swing. Then the spending started to spiral. A mansion in Beverly Hills wasn't enough. She bought a villa in Malibu, too. One sports car turned into 3. There were yachts, private jets, closets full of designer clothes she'd only wear once. I saw the photos online, champagne bottles stacked like pyramids parties, where the guests looked like they'd stepped out of a movie, smiles that seemed stretched too thin. I kept a notebook by my side every time I scrolled through her social media. At first, it was just names and dates, but soon I began to notice patterns. Daniel was always there, always at the center of it. And wherever Daniel appeared, so did whispers of investments, new ventures, and opportunities. I remembered something one of the bartenders had told me months before. He said Daniel never paid for his own drinks. He's the kind of guy who talks fast, gets someone else to pick up the tab, and disappears before the bill comes, the bartender had said, with a laugh. At the time, it sounded like a small annoyance. Now I realized it was a glimpse of the larger man, someone who lived entirely on other people's resources. The rumors started small, like hairline cracks in glass. An old business partner posting online about money owed. A company name associated with Daniel quietly vanishing from California's registry. Then a bigger one, a gossip column claiming Emily's empire of businesses was a front, that Daniel was moving money around faster than anyone could track. I read every word carefully, underlining phrases, circling names. Each article, each whisper was another sign the avalanche was coming. But the hardest part wasn't the rumors. It was watching Emily's smile fade. At first, her photos were all laughter and flashing lights. But over time, I noticed something in her expression, a stiffness like her smile was glued on. Her eyes looked tired. She was surrounded by people, but I could see the loneliness creeping in. I knew that look. I'd seen it in the mirror after Margaret died. I wanted to reach out to tell her I saw the storm coming, and she needed to get out before it swallowed her whole. But I stayed silent. She wasn't ready to hear me, not yet. My words would bounce off the walls Daniel had built around her. So instead, I prepared. I kept gathering evidence on Daniel, his failed businesses, his lawsuits, the people he'd scammed before. I spoke quietly to those who'd crossed paths with him, people eager to vent about how he'd ruined them. Each story went into my notebook. I didn't know how or when, but I knew this book would one day be my weapon. At the same time, I studied Emily's behavior from afar, who she surrounded herself with, what she posted, the parties she attended. Most of her friends were people I'd never seen before, faces that changed from month to month. I noticed how quickly they disappeared once the free meals and lavish gifts stopped. They weren't friends, they were vultures. One evening, I saw a photo of her at a rooftop party in downtown Los Angeles. She was wearing a glittering dress, holding a glass of champagne, smiling at the camera. But I couldn't take my eyes off the people around her. None of them were looking at her. They were looking at the camera, at the spectacle, at the wealth. Emily wasn't the star of that photo. She was the bait. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at Carl's kitchen table long after he'd gone to bed, staring at the notebook. My hands shook with a mix of fear and anger. Fear for my daughter, anger at Daniel for leading her into this trap, and anger at myself for not being able to stop it. But then I remembered Margaret's words. Years ago, when Emily was still a child, Margaret had said to me, "John, sometimes the only way she'll learn is by falling. You can't always catch her." At the time, I thought it was too harsh. But now it felt like prophecy. I whispered into the quiet kitchen, "All right, Margaret, I'll let her fall, but I'll be here when she hits the ground." The next weeks only proved me right. Emily's face began appearing in headlines not for her wealth, but for her debts. Whispers of lawsuits grew louder. People who once called her generous began calling her reckless. I read each article with a mix of sorrow and grim satisfaction. The cracks were spreading. The avalanche was near. And then it happened. 3 days after she threw me out of her house, Emily's empire began to collapse. Daniel vanished, taking millions with him. Her so-called friends stopped answering her calls. The mansion doors that had once been wide open to partygoers now closed on her, the silence deafening. And just like that, the girl who told me I didn't belong came knocking on my door, tears in her eyes. The call came on a Wednesday evening. I was sitting in Carl's living room, the TV humming in the background when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in weeks, Emily. For a moment, I froze. My thumb hovered over the answer button. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her feel the same silence she had left me in. But my heart betrayed me. She was still my daughter. I pressed accept. Her voice was broken. "Dad," she sobbed, "please, I need you." Those 4 words ripped through me. All the anger, the humiliation, the sleepless nights in cheap motels, they collided with the memory of the little girl who once clung to my neck when thunderstorms scared her. My chest tightened, and I whispered, "Where are you?" An hour later, I found her outside my motel. She was sitting on the curb, knees pulled to her chest, her makeup smeared, her dress wrinkled like she hadn't slept in days. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked nothing like the glamorous woman in magazines. She looked small, lost. When she saw me, she stood and stumbled into my arms. "He's gone," she cried. "Daniel's gone. He took everything. Dad, I don't know what to do." I held her, my hands trembling. I wanted to tell her I'd warned myself this would happen. I wanted to remind her of the way she'd thrown me out like a stranger, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just let her cry. Inside the motel room, she sat on the bed, her shoulders shaking. Between sobs, the story came out. Daniel had drained her accounts, disappeared overnight. Lawsuits were piling up. The houses, the cars, the jewelry, all leveraged, all slipping through her fingers. The so-called friends who once drank her champagne had vanished, their phones suddenly disconnected. I sat in the chair by the window, listening in silence. Every detail cut me not because of the money, but because of the pain in her voice. This wasn't just financial ruin. This was the shattering of everything she thought she knew about loyalty, trust, and love. For hours she cried and begged, "Please, Dad, you have to help me. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know where to go." Her words were desperate, frantic, but I stayed quiet. I let the silence settle between us, not because I didn't care. God knows I cared more than anything, but because I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices. She needed to sit in that silence to realize the full gravity of what she had done. I thought about Margaret then. I imagined her sitting beside me, her hand on mine, whispering, "Don't protect her from every storm, John. Some lessons she has to learn in the rain." My throat tightened. I could almost hear her voice blending with Emily's sobs, two echoes of the women I loved most. Finally, Emily looked up at me, her eyes red, her face streaked with tears. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." The words hit me harder than any betrayal. My body shook with a mix of sorrow and relief. I had waited months, maybe years, to hear those words, but I never imagined they'd come like this from a broken woman sitting in a dingy motel begging for the father she once discarded. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and said softly, "Emily, I can't fix this for you, but I can stand beside you while you fix it yourself." She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. For the first time in a long while, I saw the little girl again. Not the heiress, not the socialite, not the woman blinded by millions. Just Emily, my Emily. That night, she fell asleep on the motel bed, her face still damp with tears. I sat in the chair all night watching her breathe. My chest ached with exhaustion, but I couldn't close my eyes. I knew this was only the beginning. Her empire had collapsed, but rebuilding her life and our relationship would be harder than either of us could imagine. As the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, I opened my leather notebook and flipped through the pages of names, dates, evidence. Daniel's trail was all there, waiting to be used. For months, I had been patient, biding my time. Now the time had come. I looked at my daughter sleeping and whispered to myself, "All right, Margaret, she's fallen. Now it's time to help her stand again. But first, he has to pay." I closed the notebook, slipped it back into my bag, and leaned back in the chair. The storm had hit. The avalanche had buried her, but I was still here, steady as the mountain, waiting for the right moment to strike. Morning light spilled through the thin motel curtains, painting the room in a gray, tired glow. Emily stirred on the bed. Her mascara smeared her hair, tangled. For a second, I saw the little girl who used to crawl into bed between Margaret and me after a nightmare. But then she sat up, clutching her head, and reality settled back in. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I don't know what to do." I sat quietly in the chair by the window, my leather notebook resting on my lap. I'd spent the entire night turning pages, reviewing notes, replaying conversations with strangers who had once been Daniel's victims. Every breadcrumb I had gathered was right there, written in my careful handwriting. For months I had waited for this moment, not because I wanted her to fail, but because I knew she wouldn't listen until the facade crumbled around her. "You don't need to know yet," I said softly. "What you need is to sit with what's happened, to see it clearly." She buried her face in her hands and sobbed again. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't pat her back or tell her it would be okay. Instead, I let the silence do the work. Silence is a teacher in its own right, harsher than words, sharper than lectures. Hours passed like that. She cried, then paced the room, then sat staring at the floor, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress. I stayed in my chair, notebook closed, eyes fixed on her, but lips sealed. My silence spoke louder than anything I could have said. Finally, in the late afternoon, she looked at me with swollen eyes. "Did you know?" Her question hung heavy between us. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "I suspected," I said. "I saw things you couldn't because you didn't want to. Daniel's trail was there, plain as day, for anyone willing to look past the charm. I chose not to warn you." Her mouth fell open, her face flushing red. "You knew, and you didn't tell me." I nodded slowly. "If I had told you, would you have listened, or would you have thought I was jealous, bitter, trying to hold you back?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her silence was the answer. I pulled the notebook onto the bed between us and opened it. Page after page of notes, documents, scribbled names and arrows connecting dates to places. Her eyes widened as she flipped through them. "What is all this?" she asked. "It's Daniel," I said quietly. "Every scam, every partner he burned, every debt he left behind. He's been doing this for years. You weren't his first victim, Emily. And you won't be his last." Her hands shook as she turned the pages. For the first time in weeks, she looked at me not as a burden, not as an outsider, but as her father. The same father who had stayed up nights at the kitchen table helping her with homework. The same father who had carried her on his shoulders at the fair. She saw me again. I didn't tell her how many sleepless nights it had cost me, how much pain it caused to watch her spiral while I stayed quiet. I didn't need to. She could see it in my eyes. She set the notebook down, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" I exhaled slowly, leaning back in the chair. "First, you stop thinking like the girl who had everything handed to her. You start thinking like the woman who lost it all. Only then can you rebuild." Her shoulders slumped, but she nodded. I thought of Margaret again, her gentle voice, her wisdom. She had warned me once long ago that shielding Emily from every storm would only leave her unprepared for the world. At the time, I hated hearing it. But now, watching my daughter broken but alive, I realized she had been right. That evening, I took Emily for a walk through the neighborhood near the motel. It wasn't glamorous, cracked sidewalks, faded storefronts, families scraping by. She walked beside me in silence, her heels clicking against the pavement, her designer dress looking out of place among the modest houses. "Do you see them?" I asked, nodding toward a mother shepherding 3 kids across the street. They don't have $33 million. They don't have mansions or yachts, but they're together. They're surviving. And so can you. Emily didn't reply, but I noticed her shoulders straighten. Back at the motel, she asked me one more question. "Why didn't you walk away, Dad, after everything I did to you after throwing you out? Why are you still here?" I looked at her, my throat tight. "Because I'm your father, and love doesn't vanish just because someone loses their way. It waits. It hurts, but it waits. And when you're ready, it helps you stand again." Her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "I don't deserve you." I didn't answer. Some truths don't need words. That night, she slept with the notebook beside her as if it were a lifeline. I lay awake in the chair again, my eyes on the ceiling, my mind steady. I had waited months for this moment. I could wait longer still, but the time for silence was nearly over. The time for action, for using my secret weapon, was drawing near. Daniel thought he'd disappeared without a trace. He thought he'd left Emily broken and me forgotten. But he didn't know I had been following his footprints in the sand all along. And soon, I would bury him with them. The next morning, I woke before Emily. The motel room was silent except for the steady hum of the old air conditioner. I sat in the chair, watching her sleep, her chest rising and falling slowly. For the first time in weeks, her face looked peaceful, vulnerable, almost childlike again. I realized then that the storm had done what all my words could not. It had stripped away her illusions. When she finally woke, she looked at me with clearer eyes. Tired, yes, but softer than before. "What do we do now, Dad?" she asked, her voice raw. It was the question I'd been waiting for. I opened the notebook, spread it across the table, and slid it toward her. "We rebuild, piece by piece, but we do it the right way this time." She leaned over the pages, scanning the names and dates, the evidence of Daniel's scams. Her brow furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "How did you find all this?" she whispered. "By listening," I said. "By keeping my mouth shut when it mattered and writing down what others ignored." She shook her head. "I thought you were just old-fashioned, out of touch. I never realized." Her voice trailed off. "You never realized how much I finished for her. But that's all right. You see it now." From that day on, things began to change, slowly but surely. Emily stopped chasing the lifestyle that had consumed her. The fancy clothes, the parties, the endless spending, it all slipped away. What remained was the raw truth. She had debts, she had lawsuits, and she had to face them. I stood beside her through it all, but I didn't carry her. When collectors called, I made her answer. When lawyers demanded explanations, I told her to speak for herself. It hurt to watch her stumble, to hear the quiver in her voice, but I knew this was the only way she would grow stronger. At the same time, I worked quietly in the background. I contacted a few old friends from my working years, men who had connections in places Daniel thought were buried. One was a retired accountant who had a knack for sniffing out shell companies. Another was a lawyer who owed me a favor from years back when I'd helped him out of a jam. Piece by piece, I began building a case. The more I uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Daniel hadn't just scammed Emily. He'd left a trail of wreckage across half a dozen states. Small businesses ruined, investors duped, families left bankrupt. He wasn't just a smooth talker, he was a predator. I shared pieces of this with Emily carefully. enough to show her the truth, but not enough to overwhelm her. I wanted her to see Daniel for what he truly was, not just as the man who had stolen her money, but as the man who had preyed on her trust. At first, it crushed her. She cried, cursed, threw the notebook across the room one night in anger. "How could I have been so blind?" she shouted. I picked up the notebook, set it gently back on the table, and said, "Because you wanted to believe." And he counted on that. Her tears slowed, and she nodded. Slowly, I began teaching her the lessons she had ignored before: how to budget, how to negotiate, how to tell when someone was using flattery to get inside your pockets. We spent nights at the kitchen table of Carl's house papers spread everywhere, me walking her through the basics of rebuilding her life. It felt almost like those nights when she was a girl, and I helped her with homework, only now the stakes were far higher. Through it all, Daniel's shadow loomed. We knew he was out there somewhere enjoying the money he had stolen, but what he didn't know was that his past was catching up to him through me. One evening, Emily asked, "Why not just go to the police now?" I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers, because timing is everything. If we go too early, he slips away. He's done it before. But if we wait, if we build the case strong enough, we'll pin him down so tightly he won't wriggle free. She studied me, her eyes glistening. "You sound like you've been planning this all along." I gave a small smile. "I have. Betrayal teaches patience." In the weeks that followed, small victories came. A lawsuit settled, a debt reduced. Emily learned to cook her own meals again, to live without extravagance, to find joy in simple things. I could see her growing, maturing, becoming someone I barely recognized, but finally respected again. And then came the breakthrough. My accountant friend called late one night with news Daniel had resurfaced, trying to start another fake investment scheme in Nevada. He'd used a new alias, but the trail was sloppy. I smiled for the first time in months, a smile that carried no joy, only resolve. I closed the notebook, looked at Emily, and said, "It's time." She stared at me, her breath catching. Time for what? Time to turn the tables. The phone call from my old accountant friend changed everything. Daniel had resurfaced greedy as ever, trying to launch yet another can't-miss investment opportunity. He was arrogant, sloppy, convinced the world had already forgotten his trail of destruction. But I hadn't. I'd been waiting for this. For weeks, Emily and I worked quietly. With the help of my lawyer friend, we compiled the evidence into a neat, undeniable package. Bank records, testimonies, old lawsuits, connections to shell companies, everything was there. We built the kind of case Daniel couldn't laugh his way out of. Emily watched me work, often silent, sometimes crying. "You've been building this for months, haven't you?" she asked one night, her voice filled with awe. "Yes," I said simply. "I had to. Not just for you, but for everyone he's hurt. Men like Daniel don't stop unless someone makes them." The day came when we walked into the district attorney's office. Emily sat beside me, her hands trembling as we laid the file on the desk. The attorney flipped through the pages, his eyebrows rising higher with every turn. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and said, "This is more than enough." It was done. The wheels of justice began to turn. A few weeks later, news broke that Daniel had been arrested in Nevada. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. His face, once smug and polished, now stared out from a mugshot plastered across the evening news. The same tabloids that once printed photos of him in tuxedos now printed his charges in bold letters. I sat in Carl's living room watching the report. Emily sat beside me, her eyes fixed on the screen. When they showed Daniel in handcuffs, she gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of release. "He can't hurt me anymore," she whispered. "No," I said softly, "he can't." But justice wasn't the only victory. The real victory came in the quiet weeks that followed. Emily sold off what was left of her luxury possessions, the cars, the jewelry, the excess homes gone. What little remained after the lawsuits and debts she kept carefully. For the first time in her life, she lived within her means. I watched her learn to cook simple meals again, to shop for groceries, to sit with a cup of coffee in the morning without needing an audience. She even laughed again, not the brittle performative laugh of parties and photo ops, but the soft laugh I remembered from her childhood. One evening, as we sat on Carl's porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me and said, "Dad, I don't deserve your forgiveness." I looked at her, my heart heavy. Forgiveness isn't something you earn, Emily. It's something I give, and I give it because I love you. Always have, always will. She broke down, then sobbing into my chest, whispering, "Thank you," over and over. I held her the way I used to when she was small, rocking her gently, feeling the weight of years of pain finally lift. Later she asked, "What made you wait? Dad, why didn't you stop him sooner?" I thought for a long moment before answering, because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't about stopping the fall, it's about letting someone see exactly what they've lost. Daniel will spend years behind bars, but your lesson, the lesson that money can't buy love, that arrogance blinds you, that's a punishment only life could deliver, and it's a lesson you'll never forget. She nodded, her eyes glistening in the fading light. Months passed, and Emily slowly rebuilt her life. She got a modest apartment, took a job at a local nonprofit, started working with people who had been conned out of their savings, people like her. She told me one night, "If I can help even one person avoid what I went through, maybe it'll mean something." I felt pride swell in my chest, not the pride of wealth or status, but the pride of a father who had watched his daughter fall, shatter, and rise again, stronger, wiser. As for me, I found peace in the silence. I tended to small things again, fixing a leaky faucet at Carl's reading books I'd set aside for years, sitting on the porch with coffee while the morning sun warmed my face. Life didn't give me back the years I lost, but it gave me something else, the satisfaction of knowing I hadn't broken when betrayal came knocking. Sometimes late at night, I'd whisper into the darkness, "We did it, Margaret. She's safe now. She's found her way back." And in those quiet moments, I swore I could feel her presence, warm and steady, like a hand on my shoulder. Emily still carries scars. So do I. But scars are proof of survival, reminders of the battles we fought and the lessons we've learned. She knows now that love isn't measured in dollars, that family isn't disposable, that betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from within, and that redemption is possible even after the worst mistakes. And me, I know that revenge doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is to outlast the betrayal, to live well, to guide with patience, and to let the truth do the punishing. So, if you've stayed with me through this story, I'll leave you with this guard, your heart treasure, those who truly stand beside you and never let betrayal make you bitter. And if you've found something in my story that touched you, please consider subscribing to this channel. It means more than you know. Because sometimes the best way to share a lesson is to tell it, and maybe, just maybe, my scars can help someone else heal.